Welcome to the Dad Nobody Wants to Listen to You About New York podcast. This is episode 4, and it's called The Gentrification Scam. Now, gentrification isn't necessarily a scam, but Brooklyn and other New York neighborhoods have become the epicenter for American gentrification. Gentrification is sold as being a way to improve neighborhoods that have been very run down. Usually these neighborhoods are communities of color, and they probably worked very hard to guard their neighborhoods against the effects of gentrification. But are all the effects of gentrification positive? I want to look into that more in my podcast. In many respects, gentrification is one of the main factors that is generating positive change in New York. The word gentrification, believe it or not, comes from the English language, and it's about those of a social upper class. It was introduced, I believe, by a sociologist back in 1964 to discuss London and how it had changed and how the arrival of much wealthier people into an existing urban district somehow correlated with increasing rents and property values, and improved the general culture and the character of the district. It's, I suppose, more informally known as kicking out the neighborhood's poor in favor of bringing in the rich. So the effects of all of that in New York City are greatly multifold, but it's really caused an astronomical increase in rents and a huge amounts of new residents going into formerly very diverse neighborhoods, which have then suffered by the lack of small businesses and loads of people being kicked out of their areas and trying to move to further away areas to survive. Historically, what is quite interesting about New York and Brooklyn generally is that it used to be a predominantly white area. Back in the 1950s and 1940s, Harlem became a neighborhood where the most black New Yorkers lived. And eventually, by about 1953 or so, parts of Brooklyn and central Brooklyn started receiving more and more black people. But in these early days, around 1940, 90,000 out of 110,000 black people who lived in Brooklyn lived in a very, very small, defined area, which became known as Black Brooklyn. So almost in a complete reversal of what's happening now, between 1940 and, say, the 2000s, the white population of Brooklyn declined by about 70%, and the black population increased by about 700%. So the number of whites living in Brooklyn went from about 1 million in 1940 to about 70,000, and the number of blacks increased from about 95,000 in 1940 to nearly 800,000 by 2000. But now, almost 90% of black Brooklynites have lived in Black Brooklyn for more than half a century. During the history, considerable amounts of white people started moving out because the neighborhoods were declining, and they wanted to move to more desirable parts of Brooklyn, such as Brooklyn Heights. And they managed to get guaranteed mortgages, and they found that the property prices were increasing there. And I think also there was a lot of defensive behavior in those days where the whites were not prepared to leave originally, and they set up all sorts of defense against black and Latino populations moving into their areas. This type of defense wasn't so much violence, it was more real estate agents and landlords who were discriminating against renting or selling houses to minority populations, or financial institutions that denied deliberately mortgages to minority populations, trying to keep the neighborhood white. There was this desire to keep racial exclusivity in white neighborhoods, and I think, they were using the police to their advantage because there were a lot of hassled minorities. And there was a lot of enforcement against black people in order to make them feel very uncomfortable walking around the white areas of Brooklyn. There was, of course, a deliberate policy of discrimination and racial segregation in these neighborhoods. and loads of Americans were basically being forced to live in terrible conditions in areas like Brownsville. And Brownsville houses in 1948 were some of the biggest areas of public housing in the area. And there was this reverse discrimination going on in these sort of areas, because they would only accept in these slum clearance projects in Harlem and places like that, Black and Latino tenants. The white people were basically refused. And all this caused the build-up of Catholic areas and focused on areas where Blacks and Latinos and Jewish people could separately live from each other. And in time, most of the Brooklyn neighborhoods that did become majority Black had two sections. There was the ones with very decrepit sort of houses, there were where the white minorities had abandoned them, and the second section was probably occupied by whites who had better housing, and they had this white neighborhood defense going on. And so back in the 60s, white areas were rapidly being turned into Black areas, and it was a deliberate policy, mainly driven by something that was called block busting. And this was when usually estate agents and various people decided to do something about trying to get rid of the white people and put Black families up and down to try to frighten the whites into leaving the area, which would then mean that they could get these houses and sell them and make a real profit. But this didn't work everywhere. There were large sections of North Brooklyn, such as Williamsburg and Greenpoint, that remained white because they had this neighborhood defense. And you could be sure that if you were living in parts of Greenpoint and Williamsburg, that there was going to be all sorts of things done to try to make sure that they could keep it as affluent and as white as possible. This occurred also in other areas of Brooklyn, such as Carroll Gardens. So by about 1980, most whites had abandoned Black Brooklyn, either through desire or because of fear and intimidation, and were living in other parts of the borough. Then throughout the 1970s, African-American middle class was growing, and they faced tremendous discrimination from financial institutions and real estate agencies, and they moved into these very low-income areas in order to be able to set up home. The main gentrification that we see today happened in about the 1990s, where there was a tremendous influx of white people into the Black neighborhoods. The numbers of whites almost doubled in Black Brooklyn between 2000 and 2018. One of the main areas that is now being gentrified is Crown Heights or the area of Buswick. It's no surprise, really, because downtown Brooklyn is full of lovely brownstone buildings, and it has tremendous communications with good railway lines and great things for people to have. It's become quite a choice location for New Yorkers, and it's considered to be a great place with racial diversity by younger white people. But there are still many areas of Brooklyn where white people will not move to, so that still does nothing about improving racial segregation. So, as you can see, historically, gentrification has worked for both racial groups. Originally, whites were moved out and the Blacks moved in, and now it seems more and more that the whites are moving back in and more Blacks and Latinos are moving out. The process of gentrification isn't by no means all bad. One of the best things about it is that the housing tends to be improved. All the old buildings are demolished and nice new high-rises are built and lofts and apartments. You see this in districts of New York, such as Soho. I mean, Soho used to be a really run-down, dilapidated place, and I remember walking around it back in the 1980s, and it was almost a no-go area. But today, if you go down, as I was just a few weeks ago, there's so many newly constructed buildings and the whole neighborhood has changed. It's one of the most in-demand places to live in the whole of Manhattan. The parks are clean, the streets are clean. There are lovely shops, cafes and restaurants to go to. Although I have no personal example of this, I know that there's lots more funding going into these areas and you tend to get more qualified teachers. There are much nicer artistic opportunities, and the streets are better maintained. Certainly in terms of crime in these gentrified areas, you tend to find that there are less assaults and robberies and homicides. And you find that people who live in nicer areas tend to encourage less violent behavior amongst their inhabitants. And I think this is probably, again, why the New York City government tries to push this idea of gentrification as a very desirable quality. But certainly in Brooklyn and, of course, in Manhattan, the undesirable effect of gentrification are the tremendous increases in rents and the cost of housing. And I think during the real gentrification periods of 1990 to about 2014-15, places like Williamsburg and Greenpoint and Central Harlem, the Lower East Side, Chinatown, Bushwick, East Harlem, Bedford, Washington Heights, all these areas saw rent prices increase more than 20 to 30%. And certainly in areas like Williamsburg and Greenpoint, the greatest increase has been seen there, as much as 78%. During the COVID period, evictions were made illegal because people were obviously not working, people couldn't afford rents, there were all sorts of social problems. So there was a sort of a moratorium in the courts on all the evictions. But as soon as the COVID system just disappeared, all these evictions started up again in earnest. And at the moment, I think there are nearly 200,000 cases going through the New York courts of people trying to get people evicted from their properties. So now the number of black residents in parts of Brooklyn are declining quite greatly. And in gentrified areas such as Washington Heights and Williamsburg and Greenpoint, the number of, say, Hispanic residents is experiencing a huge decline as well. I think as many as 10,000 residents have disappeared between 2000 and 2015. So you could argue that rather than having a local flavor, you now tend to have this rather bland and homogenized area, which is culturally rich, I suppose, in its own way, but it's not what it was. I saw the effect of gentrification myself when I was living in Bushwick in July. And I could see how in a gentrifying neighborhood such as Halsey Street, where I was living, a lot of the typical immigrant mother and father stores are being replaced by art galleries, boutiques, and affluent cafes. And it was also very interesting to note that in these cafes and boutiques, there were mainly white patrons. So after thinking about it and all the positive and negative effects of gentrification, there still remains one really important point. If you gentrify all the neighbors of New York City, what are you going to be left with? You're going to be pushing the poor people out of the city, and in the process you break up their communities. This gentrification has been likened by some people to almost apartheid in both race and class. It's also been argued that pushing all these different races into the periphery of society and out of the central areas is almost the root of many of the economic, social, and moral evils of the United States of America now. So you could say that rather than improving the quality of living for everyone, you're actually now just creating new ghettos outside of these rich white areas, and you're not improving the economic and social well-being of society at all. So rather than sorting out social problems, you're kind of sweeping everything under the carpet and trying to ignore what's really going on in society by pushing everyone out to the more marginalized parts of the community. So by moving huge quantities of people out of areas during gentrification into areas that are very run down and poor, the city government is avoiding its responsibility to upgrade the facilities and all the infrastructure there. And it almost becomes out of sight, out of mind. And people just don't even begin to pay any attention to what's going on in those communities. Like so many things, it's just kicking the social problems out of sight, not in my backyard. For the concluding part of the podcast, I just want to discuss the real on-the-ground effects of gentrification that I've seen personally. And during my holiday in the summer, I stayed in Buswick in Brooklyn, and I got to see what was going on there. Buswick is a neighborhood to the southwest of Williamsburg, and it's mainly Latino, and it has very strong immigrant working class roots. And it's very characterized now more by music and the art scene, and it's very full of people who've come from outside New York, and probably rich people from New York who can no longer afford to live in New York. So it's full of young professionals. And they sit in a very uneasy relationship with the local Bushwick residents. This sort of myth that's created that gentrification creates a sort of a multi-diverse community is not really true, because, as I mentioned to you, the whites tend to live in the nicer done-up houses, and they're not right next to the people living in the very poor houses. And the cafes and the restaurants are almost apartheid, where the wealthy white people are living next to nice, clean cafes that are selling nice cakes and a nice environment to sit in. And if you look through the windows, everybody sitting in there is white. The Black and Latino community are largely existing as they always have. Most of them very nicely and very happy in their environments, but a lot of very poor ones on the streets, hanging outside these drug shops or the community stores. And they are just carrying their street life out as they always have. And I don't mind saying that somehow that can be quite threatening, particularly when you're walking back from Halsey Street subway station at night and you're going past blaring cars playing salsa music, drunks in the street, drug dealing on the corners. And yet you're still further along the road running into what is called a gentrified area, where you've got a bar with a lot of wealthy white people inside. So it doesn't feel that it's some sort of homogeneous unit, some form of community that is somehow cohesive. It still feels as if you've got white people who've moved into a predominantly Latino neighborhood and are somehow either hiding there in plain sight or slowly trying to take it over. Rents are going up, and more people are being displaced from their houses. Houses that used to have apartments for $1,000 a month are probably now asking at least $3,000 a month. So more and more these long-time Bushwick residents are seeing that they're having to move away because of economic struggles. It's happening now in Buswick that landlords are harassing and abusing their Latino and Black tenants because they need to get them out so they can turn the houses into nice white middle-class style apartments and get bloated housing prices. In many ways, it's very sad for me to come back to Manhattan after many, many years, and particularly a time when I used to live in the 1980s in what at the time was a very multiracial society. Things seemed to be going backwards. The gentrification of areas like Bushwick seemed to be forcing the white people into neighborhoods that used to belong to ethnic communities. These ethnic communities are then looking at the white invaders, as the mayor almost called them, or did call them, as hijackers of the communities. And increasingly, the neighborhoods are not actually gentrifying in a nice way. The streets are dirty, the buildings are falling down, the care in the community is just very, very lacking. The park was full of rubbish, the streets are full of rubbish. And that's because the people who've lived there for 50 years or more, generational people, don't feel that they have a great love for their neighborhood anymore. They're being pushed out of their neighborhood, and they probably are now paying more in rent, and they cannot afford to use money to invest in their local communities. And the white people who are moving into the area, they are taking these nice prime spaces, they're refurbishing them, they're making the values go up, but it's doing nothing for the local community. The local shops and amenities that are opening up to cater to these white people are not catering for the rest of the community. the shops that do cater to the Latino community continue to be very dirty, very run down, and very unloved. So gentrification is having a really negative impact on Bushwick as far as I can see. When I was introduced to Bushwick as a place to live, it was described as being a vibrant, up-and-coming, gentrifying, artistic area where a lot of young people were moving to because of the cafes and the bars. I mean, you hear that all the time as if it's some sort of general excuse for the positives of gentrification. But I can tell you on the ground, it's really not that at all. There may be some clubs, there may be some restaurants, there may be some art galleries, but it's almost like going into a theme park rather than actually a place to live. So really, with gentrification in Brooklyn, it's a tale of two Bushwicks. One with very poor people who have limited English proficiency. I think only 30% of people speak English at all. There's very low educational attainment. I think in a survey I read, I think 24% of the residents had a degree or higher compared to 34% in the rest of Brooklyn. So there's two types of Bushwick. The one is white and affluent, and the other is Latino and struggling with the terrible housing situation. People who try to live in that part of the town find it practically impossible to afford to live there now. And everywhere that you go, you see groups of young people who are looking for the next bar or the next party. There is talk now in New York of rezoning Bushwick in such a way that the community can just about hang on to what it's got without big condos and buildings moving in and the complete regentrification of the place. That's as well. It might be that they can do that and they can keep affordable housing. They might be able to keep the real Latino culture and the people who live there. I hope so in a way, because what makes Brooklyn wonderful is that it always used to have these diverse communities. But if what I have seen in Bushwick is what's happening throughout, it's going to be very hard. I can't see that Bushwick is going to survive. It's going to be very similar to another area that I lived in about 15 years ago called Carroll Gardens. That was at the periphery then of the gentrification that had come from Brooklyn Heights. If you go there now, it's completely gentrified, and the whites are greatly outnumbering any other form of racial group. So I think, in fact, the outlook for Bushwick is not very good, unless somebody decides to do something about it now, before it's too late. Bushwick has had a violent and dangerous history. It's never been a terribly safe place. And for much of its existence, it's been a center for riots and looting. And there's still tremendous tensions that exist in this largely Hispanic area. But to be fair, there is still the chance that a transformation can help the Bushwick residents. I know that there was a Columbia University president who wrote recently that gentrification, in fact, drives few low-income residents from their homes. That might be true. On the other hand, it might be nice if you could think that these Bushwick residents may be encouraged to stay and enjoy the fruits of the revival that is taking place. I certainly hope so. But some of the signs are not good. A lot of the Hispanic residents who remain are very upset, and they consider the Bushwick newcomers as vultures. And they've created an advocacy group called the Youth Power Project that's trying to rally the area's Latino youth against all this new building and renovating, claiming it's going to push out the poor residents. So as ever, far from creating a homogeneous community, it's creating yet more division. I hope somebody will do something about it.